people asked me to come on and talk today about the killing of Alex Pretti in Minneapolis today. And I'm happy to do that. As I always tell you, I'm happy to come on if something big happens, but I wanted to make sure that I had enough of the story that I wasn't simply screaming, oh my God, this happened. And so since it happened, I've actually, if you watch me this morning, you will see I'm wearing exactly the same clothes, including the same coat I had on during this morning's broadcast, because I haven't really gotten up since then. Um, uh, which is not, of course, how any of us expected to spend today. So let me start in on what we know happened, and then I will tell you a little bit about what the larger story is and perhaps what we can do. And I want to be clear, I am incensed. I am furious beyond articulation. So if I seem very flat today, it is because of that fury. All right. So what we know happened today, and I've written everything down so I would get it right, is that at least 7 federal agents this morning at about 9 o'clock local time shot and killed Alex Jeffrey Pretti. He was a 37-year-old man who was an ICU nurse at the local VA hospital. Now, you will note there that I said federal agents. I did not say ICE. It is not clear right now from what agency they came. And it looks, again, remember, everything I'm saying is very new. It looks as if he was not an ICE agent, but the shooters were not ICE agents, but were rather from Customs and Border Patrol. And that I've told you about before. That is a division of another agency that has been infamous for its out of control, violent recklessness. That's the agency that is headed by Gregory Bovino. And it looks as if they're the actual shooters, not ICE. We tend to use ICE or Immigration and Customs Enforcement as a catch-all for all the federal agents. But let me remind you yet again that the Department of Homeland Security actually has a number of pockets of agents that it can use. And while ICE is the biggest, has the most people in it, the most violent currently appear to be those from Customs and Border Patrol. All right, so as always these days, there was video of the shooting, a number of different angles on the shooting, and it is easy, if you see them, to put together what happened. There are a number of videos, as I say, and one of the earliest ones starts with Pretti on a street in Minneapolis, directing traffic around an area where there are ICE agents. There are not a lot of people there. It's not a huge crowd, but there are definitely people on the street. Oh, and by the way, there are definitely people on the street. I don't recommend that you watch these. These are very, very hard videos. The agents begin to harass a person near Pretti, and I'm not making any assumptions about names or anything at this point because that's still a little, at least to me, not clear. She is the person is pushed to the ground by an ICE agent, and Pretti reaches down to help her back up. As he does that, a federal agent shoots pepper spray into his face. He has a camera in one hand, and with the pepper spray, he lifts up his hand to block the pepper spray. Agents then pull him to the ground from behind him, and they begin to hit him. And there are, it looks to be 7 of them. He doesn't really appear to be fighting back. You're seeing people talk about a struggle and so on. To me, it looks like he's trying to keep his head off the ground. He keeps trying to push himself up to keep his head off the ground, which of course is something you would likely want to do if you're being jumped by 7 people. During that struggle, as Pretti is face downward, an agent takes a gun from his waistband, the back of his waistband, or what certainly looks to be a gun and is being identified as a gun. He has not reached for it or anything. His hands are on the ground. Then the agent turns and leaves. He is starting to walk away with his back to the scene when one shot rings out and Pretti stops moving. After that, 9 more shots ring out as agents, and we don't know if one agent fired all 10 shots or if there was more than one agent who fired all 10 shots. At least I don't know that yet. As they continued to fire into what appeared to be his lifeless body. People have compared it to an execution. It certainly looks like an execution. And after the shooting, the agents disperse very quickly. They walk away, and they apparently made no effort to preserve any kind of a crime scene. So that's what we know happened. But let's talk about how to make sense of what has happened since then. Immediately, minutes after this killing, officials from the administration came in front of the TV cameras and called Pretti, said he was engaged in domestic terrorism. They claimed that he was violent, that he had attacked the officers, and made a great deal of noise about the fact that he had a gun. Well, it appears he did have a gun in his waistband, and he was not reaching for it. He also was a registered gun owner with a legal permit for a concealed weapon in the state of Minnesota. So he was not reaching for his gun. You're going to see that all over social media from people trying to justify this. And the gun was not on his person when, at that point, 6 officers are holding him down, and he is shot 10 times. But the administration jumped right to this person is a domestic terrorist or is engaged in domestic terrorism. There's actually a little bit of a difference in the wording there. And you're seeing in a lot of media that the administration is calling people domestic terrorists with a T. I've been very cognizant of the fact that the quotations always say the person is engaged in domestic terrorism, because I suspect of a September 25 memo from the President of the United States, essentially saying that anybody who engages in any activity that seeks to stop him from putting in place his policies is engaged in domestic terrorism. And because there is very specific legal language that defines a domestic terrorist, they're actually going with that vague terrorism. I mean, that's a rabbit hole that maybe you don't care about. But I think it's important because I think what you can see, at least what it looks like to me from being in it, which always makes for a bad vantage point, that they are deliberately expanding definitions of things like terrorism in order to criminalize opposition and to justify the killing of somebody like Alex Pretti or Renee Good or some of the other people who have been shot, but so far have survived. They jump right to the idea that Pretti was engaged in domestic terrorism. But it was very interesting because immediately federal officials refused to let local police officers or a statewide Minnesota agency called the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, which specializes in police shootings. They refused to let them have access to the crime scene. When that happened, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension went to a judge and got a warrant to get them access to the crime scene. Nonetheless, the federal officials refused to give them access to the site. They have also refused to give out any of the names of any of the ICE, I'm sorry, I keep saying ICE, but that's because it's a catch-all now. the federal agents who were engaged in the shooting. So they have done everything they can to keep people away from an investigation. And there have been other rumors about what they have done that you may have read. So far, I have not seen them corroborated, so I'm not going to repeat those right now. If you have heard other things that the feds did, they may be true, they may not be true. I could not verify them with more than one source, and so I'm not going to tell you what those were. Nonetheless, Minnesota police are siding with the people of Minneapolis and of Minnesota. They are trying to investigate, they're trying to talk to witnesses, they're trying to find videos and so on. And that's the first, I guess the first important thing is that the administration has come out and blamed the victim yet again. They have blamed the victim despite the fact that once again, as in the shooting of Renee Good, there are many videos proving they are lying. This is not negotiable. There are videos from all different angles proving they are lying, just as there were those videos in the killing of Renee Good. But the administration is doubling down on that. They are, and just as recently as a few minutes before I came over here, Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, once again accused Pretti of going there to cause mass destruction, to hurt people, and to kill law enforcement officers. And that is a complete fantasy. That is not what happened at all. So that's the first important point here. The second important point is that law enforcement in Minnesota is standing firmly behind the people of Minnesota. Now, I know a lot of people have wondered about police officers, and of course, the Minneapolis police are only one police force and so on. But they have made a big point since the killing of George Floyd in 2020 to have good relationships with the people. They brought in new people. They're trying to have a good relationship with the people of the city, and they have come out and stood with the people of Minneapolis. They're not siding with the feds. They are siding with the people in Minneapolis. That's the second point that matters here. Another interesting point is that in Minnesota, a gun rights organization has come out and expressed extreme concern about this shooting. That's a gun rights organization, which almost always sides with the radical right. They are not doing so. They're not saying this is, we're dead against you, but even them expressing great concern is a knowledge point that is worth having. All right. In addition to the fact that the feds have tried to keep Minneapolis law enforcement and Minnesota law enforcement from investigating what happened, the Department of Homeland Security has also taken over the investigation, despite the fact that immediately after the shooting, it came out with a statement that said that Pretti had approached U.S. Border Patrol officers, that's where I'm getting the Border Patrol thing, with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun, that he had violently resisted as officers attempted to disarm him, that the officer fired defensive shots, and said this looks like a situation where an individual wanted to do maximum damage and massacre law enforcement. Pure, straight-up lies. And what they did is that after having said that, they took away the FBI's ability to investigate that shooting, and they say they're the ones who are going to investigate it. You know what that means, right? So here's another point to be made here after this second killing by guns. That we know of. I do want to emphasize that the Department of Homeland Security is killing people in the detention camps. And I'm not going to go down that now, but that is important to remember as well. But In addition or part of that whole takeover of this investigation is that the administration is now openly killing US citizens, and it is lying to us when we know that's what they're doing, because thank God for all those people with their cameras on their phones that are recording, because we have evidence that they are doing it. Nonetheless, they are continuing to do it. And that is a really important demonstration of authoritarianism and even totalitarianism. We know we're lying. You know we're lying. We know you know we're lying, but you have to believe us anyway. They are doubling down on that. I'm going to come back to that in just a second, because there is another thing that matters here. And that's that this is all they have got now. There's nothing they can do to say, oh, well, here's a little bit of murky ground, or, oh, there was a law for this. Or, normally when there is something that is fuzzy, that the American people don't like, there's an escape hatch. You can muddy the waters somehow. There wasn't somebody watching, or there was a law that said we could do that, written in, I don't know, 1802 or whatever. This is stark. This is all they've got, is to try and force us to believe a lie when our own eyes tell us differently. Why would they do that? And here's where I want to go with what we can take away from this. It is very clear that the person out in front on this issue is Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff. A lot of people have been talking about Miller for a long time now. He came to Trump by way of Jeff Sessions. He was on the Trump's first attorney general, who had to step down because he had contact with the Russians that he lied about. Miller came to Trump through Sessions, and Miller is an unabashed white nationalist. But there is more than that. That is, Miller is a big fan of a utopian novel from 1973. I'm not going to give you the title of it. I'm sorry, dystopian, not utopian novel from 1973 that posits that Western civilization, and by that they mean white people, although usually white Christian people and usually white Protestant people. There's some wiggle room on that because, of course, we know that Miller is Jewish. At least his family was Jewish. Posits that civilization the book was written about Europe. Miller, of course, is in the United States, is being invaded and taken over by people of color who are going to destroy it. That those people who believe in this are literally at war with invaders coming in from countries where people are people of color. This is, of course, a pure dystopian fantasy. It is racist beyond belief, but in the scheme of American history, it is more than that. That is this fantasy that somehow there are these hordes of people coming, and those of us who adhere to the principles of democracy in the United States of America that say that we are a nation of immigrants, that this is what has made us great, what the economists say and what the politicians say and what people like me say because we understand American history, that we, even if we are white, are aiding and abetting those hordes coming in. If we are defending the rule of law, if we're defending due process for immigrants, that we too are the enemies. This argument should not be seen in isolation, either from its racist roots, but also from its sort of application over arguments that Americans made beginning really in the 1980s about the fears of communism taking over the United States with the conniving of people who were already in the United States. And you see that all the way back to the 1950s with Joseph McCarthy, but you really see it in the 1980s with movies like 1984's the one in Colorado, it's not Top Gun, which is what comes immediately after that, Red Dawn. With like Red Dawn, where the whole idea is communists are taking over America with the conniving of politicians in the United States. That idea that people of color are destroying the United States with the conniving of politicians and people like me in the United States, or people who believe in democracy, are they fit right over each other. And that then suggests that people like Miller, people who believe in this idea of being replaced by people from elsewhere, who believe that somehow their civilization is not being honored and supported by immigrants the way that reality has actually played out, but is actually under siege by what almost seems like a zombie army. That then means that any violence directed at people who are not on their team can be justified. And that's really important, because that's not politics. That's not business as usual. That are the fever dreams of a disordered mind. And that seems to be what is driving this army of federal agents into our streets to kill people who are exercising the rights that have been given to all of us throughout American history in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment, the right to peaceably assemble, the right to protest, the right of a free press. Those rights, the rights from the Fourth Amendment, that you are protected from unreasonable searches and seizures of your home, for example, something this administration has thrown out. The 14th Amendment's protection of due process, the idea that they can't simply throw you on a plane and say, we've decided that you're a member of a gang, which now we know the U.S. intelligence did not believe was accurate, and ship you to a prison where you're going to get tortured. Those are our birthrights as Americans, whether you came here and got your citizenship a minute and a half ago, or whether your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, all the way back to before the Pilgrims stepped off a fishing boat in the late 1500s. That is what they are trying to get rid of. On the other side of that are those of us who believe in our democracy and who believe in our rights and who believe in our communities. And that's what happened today on the streets of Minneapolis, is that a man who was an ICU nurse, who was trying to help somebody up, got sprayed in the face with pepper spray, and then got shot 10 times on the sidewalk. How is this going to play out going forward? This is a moment. This is the moment at which it becomes too late for people to say after this, oh, I didn't know. I didn't know what was going to happen. It's out there now, between the shooting of Renee Good, and I'm just going to throw in here the kidnapping of a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, but I'm not going to talk about that today. But the shooting of Alex Pretti as well. It is no longer possible for people to say, oh, I believe in law and order, and so I support Donald Trump. This is the moment when people have to say, regardless of party, either I believe in democracy, I believe in our Constitution, I believe in the rights that the framers wrote into that Constitution, or they have to say, no, I am siding with the likes of Stephen Miller and believing that my existence is under siege by immigrants. And anything it takes to stop that, regardless of the Constitution, regardless of American citizenship, regardless of rights, has to happen. In the wake of this moment of choosing, politically, it seems to me there are important levers moving and that people like me anyway can push. One of them is that immediately Democrats are, of course, outraged, but they have also come out and said, there's no way we are going to fund DHS until ICE is reformed. That's fine because this thing is coming up next week. But I'm sorry, the funding bill is coming up next week. But remember that in what they call their One Big Beautiful Bill Act of last July, the Republicans gave a huge sum of money to the Department of Homeland Security, and part of that is a huge pot of money for ICE and Border Patrol. That money's still out there. Defunding Homeland Security tomorrow doesn't matter as long as that money is sitting out there. So you're going to hear a lot about that then, and them saying we're not going to go forward with this. That's great. I mean, that's the position, the only position the Democrats can take. But don't think that's going to change anything tomorrow, because I believe the pot of money they're sitting on, I believe, is $1.7 billion. Of course, a lot of it's spent now, but I'm not going to go down that funding thing. Although if you're interested, I have talked about it in the past. That's one thing. But here's the other, and this is the reason that I am so angry. You've heard me say this a lot. The Republicans could stop this tonight if they wanted to. Elected Republicans could stop this tonight if they wanted to. And here's the thing. You know how many Republicans that would take? 16 Republicans. 16 Republicans voting with the Democrats. This is a country of 340 million people. 16 people could stop this. And you could actually impeach and remove Trump with 23. 23 people could stop this if they wanted to. And here's why they might want to. Even if they don't care about what's happening in the streets, even if they quite like Trump or anything like that, the reason they might want to is that Trump is underwater on every issue across the country, but he's also underwater in his approval rating is negative in 40 states. 10 of those states are states that voted for him in 2024. And I'm getting my numbers here from G. Elliott Morris at Strength in Numbers. What that means is if Republicans are hoping to get reelected in 2026 and 2028 and not see the absolute decimation of their party, now is the time for them to push back. And that's a place where we have leverage. Calling your members of Congress, your Republican members of Congress, and saying, if you ever want to see us vote Republican again, you must stop ICE. You must get rid of Stephen Miller. And frankly, I think Trump's on his way out. So I worry less about that, but go for that one if you want. Although I think that one's going to be harder to do because a lot of people like to pledge their loyalty to Trump, but they actually don't like Stephen Miller at all. This is the time to really ratchet up the pressure on Republicans, because that's the only piece of this equation that can do anything right now. You can scream at Democrats all you want, but they don't have the votes. There aren't enough of them. Enough Republicans say it's time we stop this, because this can't go on for another 3 years. And retain American democracy. We're going to lose it. Now is the time for Republicans to understand that they must choose between American democracy and a regime that is destroying it. It is worth noting that in the demands that Attorney General Pam Bondi has given to Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, is a demand that he hand over the voting lists of voters in Minnesota, and he is refusing to do so. It seems pretty clear Trump is trying to rig the 2026 election, determined to stay in power, because these thugs all know now that if the Trump administration loses power, they are going to face the law. And none of them want to do that. So this is going to get worse before it gets better. But rather than simply tearing your hair out and crying, both of which are legitimate responses to what's going on in America right now, if you are interested in increasing pressure to make this end, the place to put that pressure now is on elected Republicans to say, you could stop this, and you are not. You are choosing not to. Because we have made it, I've been trying to hold that door open for a very long time for them to say, it's time. You could say something, it's time. Trump's goons are murdering American citizens who are exercising their constitutional rights in the streets. And the time to stop that was back in 2015, as far as I'm concerned, but it cannot continue. The thing to remember going forward in all of this is that what people like Stephen Miller and the goons in the street, and Trump to the degree there's anything left between his ears, what they are declaring war on is us, is American communities, is, people digging each other out of the snow, people bringing food to each other. The very communities that have always made America great. The communities that are bolstered by things like the Bill of Rights, the fact we can talk to each other without fear of the government coming down, and that we can gather however we wish, so long as we're doing it peaceably, and that, we're protected from having somebody battering down our door and saying, we're going to plant something in your house so that we can send you to jail, the way they do in places like Russia, and the fact that we can demand that we have the right to have a trial, and that we can't have the government just throw us into jail because it doesn't like us, which is what happens in countries that do not have those protections. And one of the things that I think Republican senators have believed anyway, because I've seen this referred to in speeches in the Senate, is they keep thinking that it's the courts that are the last line of defense for American democracy. And as I always say, by the time the framers got around to writing about the courts in the third article of the Constitution, they were kind of like, let's go have lunch. Let's just have some courts. They're really specific about Congress. They're really specific about the executive. They're not specific about the courts. Because who's the last defense of American democracy? It's the people. It's the people who are protected by the Bill of Rights, and who recognize that we have those rights and that we must come together to defend them. It's the people who have to make our voices known now, because the courts are going to get around to it. They are. They've been deciding against Trump, right and left, but it takes time. The American people demanding an end to this is what is finally going to end it. And I want to be very clear when I say that, I mean peaceably. I mean peaceably. There is nothing that kills a movement faster than violence. We know that throughout our history, especially in America. I can't speak for other countries. But this is the time peaceably to push back, not just on the Trump administration, but the people in it, like Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski and Stephen Miller, and all the people who have defined those of us who oppose them as participating in domestic terrorism, when we're just speaking our minds. But also to remind the Republicans in office that this is make or break time for them. They can side with the American people. They can side with our communities. They can side with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. They can side with, Teddy Roosevelt and Fannie Lou Hamer and Sitting Bull and Abraham Lincoln and, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, or they can side with Stephen Miller, the neo-Nazis, the KKK, and those people who are trying to turn this country into a fascist state. Now is the time for choosing. I thank you all for being here and for choosing each other in this moment. And all I can say is we have the numbers, we have the principles, we have humanity, and the ultimate goals of self-determination that democracy is designed to put into place. And some of us, as we are doing this, are making the ultimate sacrifice. I suspect when he woke up this morning, Alex Pretti didn't expect that he was going to become written into the history books. And I bet he would prefer not to have been. But those of us who are still here can continue to carry that torch forward. It has been quite a week, has it not? If you think back the last 7 days or maybe the last 10 days. And somebody asked what I thought about Robert Reich's piece today, in which he said that the sleeping giant has awakened. And I'm going to agree. Now, you should be aware that I've been thinking this is coming now for literally years. So maybe take what I say with maybe a whole shaker of salt. But it feels to me like things are different now than they were 10 days ago. And that the American people are really paying attention now to what Trump and his loyalists are doing, and they are no longer giving those things the benefit of the doubt, which, people usually do at the beginning of an administration. They tend to say, oh, well, it's going to be good. It's going to be good change. And look at all that person promised, and we're going to get all that stuff. And in fact, we know from the polls, which are lower by the day, that the people who voted for Trump, expecting him, for example, to make the economy better and lower inflation, are dealing with the fact that the opposite has happened, that in fact, unemployment is higher and inflation is rising. And, there are fewer job openings, and a lot of the things that he promised have not only not come to pass, we've seen the opposite. So they're looking at that. They're also looking at the fact, and I think this one's really interesting, that a lot of people thought that Trump was simply going to get rid of the criminal undocumented immigrants amongst us. And as I've said, we had the mechanisms to do that anyway. One of the issues that, we had the mechanism to do that anyway, but when he kept talking about getting rid of the worst of the worst and so on and so forth, what a lot of people didn't realize, and I remember having this argument with a MAGA voter back in last December, that the people in his orbit maintain that the very act of crossing the border without documentation makes you a criminal who is the worst of the worst. And a lot of people didn't expect to see grandmothers who'd been here for 30 years and all the people who have become part of the fabric of the United States be deported or even be rendered to third countries. And they're not happy with seeing that. And they're not happy with seeing the masked ICE agents on the streets. And they're not happy with the use of American troops in cities as well. So he's underwater on that. And he's underwater on all the other issues that he said he would do. And if you remember back during the campaign, I kept saying he's promising everything to everyone, even when the things he's promising are mutually incompatible. And you can't be wet and dry at the same time. So lots of people are going to get unhappy. And that's what you're seeing now. And we're coming now into the fall, into a period when you're going to see a lot of the policies that the administration has put in place starting really to have teeth, starting really to take effect, not least, and I'll talk more about this in the future, in a little bit, the rise in the cost of health premiums for people who are buying healthcare insurance on the Affordable Care Act markets are facing extraordinary jumps in their premiums because of the one big beautiful act, which is what they are calling the Budget Reconciliation Bill Act, that the Republicans passed in July. It got rid of the tax credits for, or the credits for purchasing health insurance for people who made between 100 and 400% of the federal poverty level. And that means that their premiums have gone up significantly, but that also means that healthier people have chosen not to enter the healthcare market. And that has meant that premiums for the people who are in it have also leaped up. And that's going to come back in before the end of this to haunt us in this moment. So there is this dropping, the sense of dropping popularity for Trump. But what happened in the last 10 days seems to me to feel different. And I think to Robert Reich as well. And that is on the heels of the murder of Charlie Kirk, the right-wing activist in Utah, about 10 days ago now. I think I've a little bit lost track of time. What you saw was the attempt of loyalists around the president to weaponize that murder to go after people they consider their political opponents before anybody had any idea even who the murderer was. And again, that person is now in custody, but still is alleged because there has not been a trial and we haven't seen evidence and so on. But even before that, there was this concerted effort to tar everybody who did not agree with Trump and MAGA as a terrorist, or as they or them or the Democrats or the left was responsible for this murder. That, I think, made people extremely uncomfortable, as it was very clear it was part of an attempt to stop criticism of the administration. And you saw that finally with the chair of the Federal Communications Commission, Brendan Carr, saying on a podcast of a right-wing podcaster who before the election was one of those who was being funded by Russia, Carr saying that ABC News better think about continuing to have comedian Jimmy Kimmel on air because it needed a broadcast license, and there were other ways in which the FCC could come down on that person or on that company because they were permitting the spread of. They couched it as an attack on the circumstances around Charlie Kirk's murder. But in fact, if you watch Jimmy Kimmel, which I had not until after this, you see that basically his monologues are a litany of attacks on Trump. And that, if you don't know Kimmel, it seems pretty clear that's what was really going on. And that really came home to a lot of people for whom I think the Constitution and the rights that we enjoy in the United States seem somewhat abstract, that they couldn't think they could lose them. And all of a sudden, a number of people, including Ted Cruz, who is a senator from Texas, but who seems to spend most of his time now with it running his podcast, including Tucker Carlson, a right-wing media personality, a lot of people who use their platforms in ways that can certainly be offensive, sort of said, wait a minute here, we've really got to protect the Constitution. And the outcry among the American people with the sudden recognition that they too could be on the wrong side of a government that was willing to do that made such pressure on Disney, which owns ABC, which is the employer of, or the group that runs Jimmy Kimmel Live, reversed course yesterday, and Jimmy Kimmel will be back on the air tonight. Jimmy Kimmel Live will be back on the air tonight, and people have said, will he have been cowed? And in that case, hasn't everybody lost? Now, listen, I am not somebody who knows that much at all about that TV world. But if you look at what Stephen Colbert did after his show was not renewed, he has certainly, I think, not pulled any punches at all. I mean, I think he's more outspoken than he was before. And I would be shocked if Kimmel doesn't do the same thing, because in a sense, he has been inoculated. But I don't know anything really about him or his or his habits. So somebody who else knows him might be able to fill people in more than that. But the point is that with that out there, a number of things became pretty apparent last week, I think, about the administration that maybe people weren't paying attention to. So, on the heels of that whole brouhaha, you had what appeared to be a direct message from Trump to Attorney General Pam Bondi, in which he expressed fury that the interim nominee, the interim person who was the U.S. attorney for the district that was looking at whether or not New York Attorney General Letitia James had committed mortgage fraud, which seemed pretty clearly to be a trumped up charge, that hadn't really happened. And this is an attempt of the administration to use the law to go after her. And also expressed fury that same person had decided not to pursue a case against James Comey, the former FBI director, who had refused to drop the case looking into whether members of Trump's 2016 campaign had been working alongside Russian operatives, or the connections between the two. Both of them were, the administration had pushed investigations of them based on what really seemed to be trumped up charges. And this interim U.S. attorney, Eric Siebert, who was very well regarded both by Republicans and by Democrats, said, I'm not going to prosecute this. I don't have evidence for that. And Trump wrote what appeared to be a direct message that he then, of course, posted for everyone to see to Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, and said, this is ridiculous. You got to go after these guys. We know they've committed crimes. I can just tell they've committed crimes, and we have to go after them. And then he reiterated that to reporters in the Oval Office. And of course, that weaponization of the political system is one that has been pretty obvious to those paying close attention for a while. But I think seeing it in black and white like that from the president really opened up the eyes of a lot of people to recognize that anybody could be next. Crossing the president made it clear that they could find someone, as was quoted on social media. That's something that one of the members of communist secret police forces have said, find the man and I'll show you the crime. I'll find something on anybody. And of course, that would be wildly impeachable for any other presidency. There was also the fact that Tom Homan, who is now Trump's border czar, his actual title is that he's an advisor to the president, is apparently, allegedly, on video. The FBI caught him on video in 2024 accepting a bag worth of $50,000 with $50,000 in it, in exchange for promising the FBI agents who were posing as business people that he would make sure they got contracts in border security in a new Trump administration. And the response in the administration to that was, first, well, he didn't commit a crime, even though that is a crime, and it certainly appears to be a crime. And secondly, he then said, well, the White House said he didn't ever take the money. And then Homan went out in public and said, well, what I did wasn't a crime. Well, again, this is a group of people who spent 4 years trying to pin on Joe Biden the idea that he had somehow accepted a bribe or that his son had accepted a bribe. And now they're saying, oh, never mind, I don't care. So there were all of those areas. And then there were a couple of others as well. The other one that jumps out are the extraordinary attacks on the American public health system by Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And that has been shown through changes to the vaccination schedule. And if you recall, he promised Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, who is himself a doctor, Robert Kennedy is not, that he wouldn't make changes to the vaccine systems in the US. And of course, as soon as he was confirmed, Kennedy went ahead and did that. He fired a whole bunch of people who are on the advisory committee for vaccines, and then they have begun the process of changing the vaccine schedules. And doctors and public health people recognize that this is a ticking time bomb. And similarly, the cuts to funding for cancer, for example, and the many ways in which the administration is attacking the public health system are really deeply problematic. And there is also, of course, what happened yesterday when Trump said he would have the FDA announce to physicians that for pregnant women to take acetaminophen during their pregnancies creates a very high risk of autism in their babies. There's just no evidence for that. There's been no change in the evidence we have. This is part of the crusade that Kennedy has been on. But again, doctors and public health people recognize that this is wildly dangerous for our public health system and for the American people. So all of those things happened at once. But why do things feel different? So I'm going to step back a little bit here and remind you that Trump all along has, since 2016, has been doing things that for any other president would be deal breakers. And he has never had to grapple with the consequences because the Republican Party supported him. No matter what he did, the Republican Party supported him, which itself is deeply problematic, but also a really interesting moment in our political history, that people who otherwise have taken oaths to the Constitution are walking away from their power to give everything over to one guy. But now things are different. And they feel different, I think, because Trump can no longer command the votes that he could even as recently as November 2024. And what I mean by that is that the Make America Healthy Again, the MAHA people, are furious at Kennedy for making a link between autism and acetaminophen or Tylenol. They wanted to see him say there was a link between autism and vaccines. And they're very angry that he did not do that. They're also angry that he has backed away from his previous claims about autism and pesticides, which is another thing that, again, a lot of researchers were exploring, and now he has backed off on that. So even though the Kennedy is infuriating people like me who care about vaccines and public health, he's also infuriating those people who turned out for Trump because he is not delivering on their pet peeves. Similarly, one of the big things for Trump getting into office in 2024 were the people who wanted to see the release of the Epstein files. That is, the government files that were compiled during the investigation of Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted sex offender. And that, again, the Trump administration ran on, they promised, and then in July of this year, backed off and said, no, we're not going to release anything. There were no files, and that case is closed. Well, then, of course, things started to leak, in which after Elon Musk had said in June that Trump was in the Epstein files. The Wall Street Journal then confirmed that later on in July, as I recall. And now we have seen some of the material. Oh, no, we've actually seen the whole birthday book that was bound in leather for Jeffrey Epstein's 50th birthday. And we have seen really suggestive, horrific things in that book. We've also seen increasing public appearances by the victims, the survivors of Epstein and his associate Ghislaine Maxwell, who is in prison, but who has been moved to a work camp, a much less strict prison than the one she was in, after talking to the Department of Justice. And a lot of people are really angry that the Epstein files are not coming out. Now, on top of all that, in this moment, there are also a couple of other big things hanging out there. One is that the farming community in the United States is hurting really badly because of the tariffs that Trump imposed, most of which a federal judge has found illegal. Now, that's going to go in front of the United States Supreme Court. And if I have time, I'll tell you more about what they're up to. But that part of the country that voted for Trump and believed that he was going to be really good for them is now hurting terribly badly because of the tariffs, especially the soybean farmers who used to sell a significant part of their crop to China and have lost all of that market. China has now gone to another country for their soybeans, and they do not have a market for those soybeans. And at the same time, they're losing a lot of their undocumented help, or even documented help, who are like, "We're out of here. We're not gonna. We're scared to show up because we're going to get into these ICE sweeps, and we can't prove that we're here legally if our papers aren't on us." So especially now the Supreme Court has said that racial profiling is okay. So that's another major Trump voting group that I'm not saying they're ever going to vote Democratic, but they may not turn out for Trump again. And then there's also what you are seeing is in this moment is a lot of the things that went into place with the cuts that the Department of Government Efficiency made, and that the Russell Vogt at the Office of Management and Budget, one of the key writers of Project 2025, has done. A lot of those clawing back of money that Congress had appropriated for education, for example, or for public health, or for universities, the clawing back of that money has badly hurt Republican districts, because Republican districts tend to be rural. And because they tend to be rural, they tend to be significantly older, and they tend to rely more on federal money because they have less of a tax base than urban areas that have younger people in them and have more people in them and more industry in them. So a lot of red areas are furiously angry at what is happening around them, to the point that, as you know, a lot of Republican lawmakers are not holding town halls because they're afraid to go in front of their constituents and they don't want to be screamed at. All right. So somebody just asked, can I comment about the UN? That's where I was going. So all of that background is there over the last week. But before I talk about the UN, have you noticed anything about President Trump lately, or J.D. Vance, the vice president? You know, Trump is always sitting behind the Resolute desk when he's in the Oval Office, with people standing behind him. You know, he doesn't move around very much. And when he is out, he often seems to be falling asleep. And he doesn't seem to hold many high-level meetings. I'll talk about that again in a minute. And when he talks, if you remember, the White House is no longer providing transcripts of his speeches, which is odd. I mean, that's part of the public record. They're supposed to do that, and they've just decided they're not going to do it. And they say, oh, well, you can watch clips, but those clips are edited. And the reason that I'm suggesting all that is because he seems unable to fill the role of the president any longer. He is incoherent. He is boastful to the point of, he sounds like an unregulated toddler. And he doesn't seem to be able really to communicate with people anymore in meaningful ways. Instead, what he is doing is increasingly boasting about a world that is not true. He keeps talking about how his poll numbers are the best in history. They're actually among the worst in history, and they're dropping. And he keeps talking about how America has conquered inflation. Well, no, inflation's on its way back up again. You know, that's just wrong. Talks about how strong the job market is. No, it's not. Talks about how well his tariffs are and all these tariffs he has negotiated. No, he hasn't. You know, now he's talking about all these wars he has stopped, even some wars that hadn't even, nobody even knew they were going to start. That's just a fantasy. That's not true at all. At the same time, he is increasingly backing away and refusing to deal with difficult issues. That being said, he certainly seems as if he is not able to fulfill the role of the president, and he's living in this sort of fantasy bubble. All right, so this morning he went to the UN. It's called the General Debate, and it's not a debate. It's where it's actually really cool, and you can read the transcripts if you're interested, and watch the videos on the UN website if you are interested, as I was. And what happens in the General Debate. It's just what it's called. Like I say, they're not debating. Is the heads of government or of state speak to the group of people who are assembled at the UN about what their priorities and what their plans are going forward. So, what happened this morning was that the Secretary General gave the speech that you would expect, saying, please remember this is the 80th year of the UN. And the reason we have the UN is because after World War II, the world's leaders decided, the Allies decided that they were going to create a world in which they could avoid World War III because World War II had been so horrible. So they created this system to establish a set of rules that would enable us to argue out wars before they start. And I'm going to do a little bit of an aside here and point out that that's a really amazing idea. If you think about the way treaties used to work, that you had treaties that if you went to war, other countries would join you, and if you were attacked, other countries would fight with you. The idea that you can have treaties to stop wars, to make sure that those things don't happen, is really kind of amazing. And what they did with the establishment of the UN was the idea of creating a world where you didn't have to solve everything with force. So he gets up there and he says, this is important and we want to make sure this stays in place, even though a lot of people are there's a lot of challenges to that around the world. And, he gives a speech and then somebody else speaks. Trump is fourth, as I recall. And he gets up and he speaks for an hour, and it is freaking unhinged. He says he's the only one who knows how to run things, that I think he even says to the people assembled that their countries are going to hell, and he's the only one who knows how to run a country, and that they're ruining their countries because of immigration and clean energy, and that we really need to do is have borders and fossil fuels. And he's just insulting, and then he just starts going about how he solved all these wars and he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. And you can just see on their faces, they are aghast, and not, I think, aghast because they were offended. There's actually somebody who texted a reporter and said, he's barking mad. Do the American people not recognize what's going on here? And that performance at the UN was, I think, a window into America, the United States of America, more than it was a statement about the United States on the world stage, because he was totally insulting and all that. But he was also not, you could see the white nationalism that had Stephen Miller's hand in it. And you could see that isolationism as well. But that was not the gist of that hour-long rambling speech at all. It was really eye-popping. So then what happened? What happened is that Trump had a meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine and basically came out and said, yeah, I'm going to back you. No, he didn't say this. He said, looks like Ukraine can win and Russia can't. And, America's going to stand behind NATO, and basically sort of said, I'm done. You guys, good luck. And that's a big deal. It appears that less than how many weeks ago was he saying that he was backing Russia and that Russia should take all of Ukraine? And now he turned around and said, well, actually, Ukraine can get all of its land back and probably more, because, of course, as we know, Russia's in terrible economic shape right now. So it was just off the charts weird, but also indicative that people who are interested in governance or in power, perhaps is a better way to put it, are almost certainly already thinking about what comes next. And I just mean, who knows? JD Vance is the next person in line to be president. He does not have his own popular following, although he is working extremely hard to step into Charlie Kirk's shoes. He did Charlie Kirk's podcast or webcast or whatever it was, and spoke at his service and was one of the more memorable speakers there. And, he's trying to pick up a younger group of people behind Christian nationalism. But in this moment, if you are a business person, it has been quite a week, has it not? If you think back the last 7 days or maybe the last 10 days. And somebody asked what I thought about Robert Reich's piece today, in which he said that the sleeping giant has awakened. And I'm going to agree. Now, you should be aware that I've been thinking this is coming now for literally years. So maybe take what I say with maybe a whole shaker of salt. But it feels to me like things are different now than they were 10 days ago. And that the American people are really paying attention now to what Trump and his loyalists are doing, and they are no longer giving those things the benefit of the doubt, which, people usually do at the beginning of an administration. They tend to say, oh, well, it's going to be good. It's going to be good change. And look at all that person promised, and we're going to get all that stuff. And in fact, we know from the polls, which are lower by the day, that the people who voted for Trump, expecting him, for example, to make the economy better and lower inflation, are dealing with the fact that the opposite has happened, that in fact, unemployment is higher and inflation is rising. And, there are fewer job openings, and a lot of the things that he promised have not only not come to pass, we've seen the opposite. So they're looking at that. They're also looking at the fact, and I think this one's really interesting, that a lot of people thought that Trump was simply going to get rid of the criminal undocumented immigrants amongst us. And as I've said, we had the mechanisms to do that anyway. One of the issues that, we had the mechanism to do that anyway, but when he kept talking about getting rid of the worst of the worst and so on and so forth, what a lot of people didn't realize, and I remember having this argument with a MAGA voter back in last December, that the people in his orbit maintain that the very act of crossing the border without documentation makes you a criminal who is the worst of the worst. And a lot of people didn't expect to see grandmothers who'd been here for 30 years and all the people who have become part of the fabric of the United States be deported or even be rendered to third countries. And they're not happy with seeing that. And they're not happy with seeing the masked ICE agents on the streets. And they're not happy with the use of American troops in cities as well. So he's underwater on that. And he's underwater on all the other issues that he said he would do. And if you remember back during the campaign, I kept saying he's promising everything to everyone, even when the things he's promising are mutually incompatible. And you can't be wet and dry at the same time. So lots of people are going to get unhappy. And that's what you're seeing now. And we're coming now into the fall, into a period when you're going to see a lot of the policies that the administration has put in place starting really to have teeth, starting really to take effect, not least, and I'll talk more about this in the future, in a little bit, the rise in the cost of health premiums for people who are buying healthcare insurance on the Affordable Care Act markets are facing extraordinary jumps in their premiums because of the one big beautiful act, which is what they are calling the Budget Reconciliation Bill Act, that the Republicans passed in July. It got rid of the tax credits or the credits for purchasing health insurance for people who made between 100 and 400% of the federal poverty level. And that means that their premiums have gone up significantly, but that also means that healthier people have chosen not to enter the healthcare market, and that has meant that premiums for the people who are in it have also leaped up, and that's going to come back in before the end of this to haunt us in this moment. So there is this dropping, the sense of dropping popularity for Trump. But what happened in the last 10 days seems to me to feel different. And I think to Robert Reich as well. And that is on the heels of the murder of Charlie Kirk, the right-wing activist in Utah, about 10 days ago now. I think I've a little bit lost track of time. What you saw was the attempt of loyalists around the president to weaponize that murder to go after people they considered their political opponents before anybody had any idea even who the murderer was. And again, that person is now in custody, but still is alleged because there has not been a trial and we haven't seen evidence and so on. But even before that, there was this concerted effort to tar everybody who did not agree with Trump and MAGA as a terrorist, or as they or them or the Democrats or the left was responsible for this murder. That, I think, made people extremely uncomfortable, as it was very clear it was part of an attempt to stop criticism of the administration. And you saw that finally with the chair of the Federal Communications Commission, Brendan Carr, saying on a podcast of a right-wing podcaster who before the election was one of those who was being funded by Russia, Carr saying that ABC News better think about continuing to have comedian Jimmy Kimmel on air because it needed a broadcast license, and there were other ways in which the FCC could come down on that person or on that company because they were permitting the spread of. They couched it as an attack on the circumstances around Charlie Kirk's murder. But in fact, if you watch Jimmy Kimmel, which I had not until after this, you see that basically his monologues are a litany of attacks on Trump. And that, if you don't know Kimmel, it seems pretty clear that's what was really going on. And that really came home to a lot of people for whom I think the Constitution and the rights that we enjoy in the United States seem somewhat abstract, that they couldn't think they could lose them. And all of a sudden, a number of people, including Ted Cruz, who is a senator at about 1:38 Eastern time this morning, the U.S. Struck Venezuela, and I figured you all would want to hear about that. And I wanted to give you the backstory for why this matters so much. Aside from the people in Venezuela, aside from the fact that Maduro is a really bad guy, aside from all that stuff, there is a much, much bigger game afoot. And I just thought I'd remind you of that before Donald Trump gets on the television and tries to explain to you why this was such a terrific idea. So let's start with the first piece that you're going to hear a lot of, and that's that Maduro's a bad guy, and he is. That just is the case. The government of Venezuela was elected originally, but then now he won't leave office, and he has destroyed Venezuela's economy. That's one of the reasons that so many Venezuelans are leaving the country and going not just to the United States, by the way, but elsewhere. That is not, however, really apparently why the Trump administration is going after Venezuela. As you know, we have been bombing small boats apparently from Venezuela. One of the things to be careful about in the news is that when people start to repeat stuff, it takes on a life of its own. So our understanding is that the small boats that the administration has been bombing by calling them narco terrorists are from Venezuela. But right now, we still don't know who those people are. So when I use words like allegedly or we think, it's worth remembering that it at least appears that one of those boats was not from Venezuela. And I say appears because the whole point is this has been shrouded in such extraordinary mystery. But the administration has been hitting those small boats, arguing that the drug traffickers that are using the country of Venezuela to move drugs are affiliated with the Maduro regime, which experts say is not the case. And it's also worth remembering that when the Trump administration insists that those drugs are killing a lot of Americans, they are implying that the drugs that are crossing Venezuela from other countries, by the way, Venezuela itself is not a big producer of drugs, it's a trafficking corridor. They're implying that those drugs are illegal fentanyl, illicit fentanyl. But they're not. The drugs that come across Venezuela overwhelmingly are cocaine, and that's what the administration has said to Congress, that this is cocaine they're going after. But then to the public, they're saying this is killing a lot of people. And cocaine is nothing to take for your health, but it's not fentanyl. So there's a lot of fuzziness going on around there. So what happened last night was an extension of that those attacks on those boats, which most legal experts think are illegal because we're not at war with Venezuela and there's been no due process for the people in those boats. And in the past, we have simply stopped those boats and taken them to a port for the legal system to work its course. And in fact, recently, the end of 2025, when the U.S. hit a couple of those boats and it appeared there were survivors, they called in the Coast Guard to come get the survivors and do the normal, which is take them to a place where they can be tried or, arrested and tried. There appears to have been a covert operation in Venezuela that Trump blurted out on the radio the other day. But now this morning, as I say, a little before 2:00, the United States appears to have struck the capital of Venezuela, Caracas, and taken out, literally not killed, but taken away Maduro and his wife. It appears that his vice president, Maduro's vice president, has fled to Russia. But again, we're early days here, and I'm just telling you what's in the news this morning so that we have a baseline for the background that I want to give to you and why this matters aside from what matters to the Venezuelan people, whom I don't study, by the way. I only know any foreign country as it interfaces with the United States. So my apologies to anybody that I can't answer any more questions on that. But the story that matters here in the United States and therefore to the rest of the world is twofold. The first part of that story is, as I have been recording now for months, Donald Trump is in an extraordinarily weak position. That is, his poll numbers are abysmal. The economy is in bad shape. There have been signs that the economy is better lately than economists are saying, but we really can't trust the numbers anymore because he has because of the delays and so on. That's not to say that the economists working in the federal government are all corrupt by any stretch of the imagination, but those numbers are just not solid anymore. In addition to that, the Epstein files are clearly a huge problem for the president, not the former president, for the president, as they are trickling out. The Department of Justice has broken the law by not releasing them as the law required by December 19th. And the ones that are coming out are already really bad enough that any other president's career would have ended. And then New Year's Eve, the Republicans on the House Oversight Committee, led by Jim Jordan, a Republican of Ohio, released the transcript of the December 17th interview that former special counsel Jack Smith gave to the House Oversight Committee about Trump's retention of classified documents and attempts to overthrow the government on January 6, 2021, and everything that went around that. And that testimony was absolutely damning. The fact that they released it at night on New Year's Eve shows you how desperate they were to hide it. So with that backstory, the Supreme Court, before the end of last year, said to Trump that in a preliminary decision, it was not the final decision, but it tended to show which way the decision was going to go, that Trump could not deploy federalized National Guard troops in the area around Chicago. That's what the suit was about. But the implication was he was going to have to pull back his federalized National Guard troops from every place they are, except Washington, D.C., which is not a state and which is overseen in a different way than the states are. And Trump immediately, or shortly after that, said, "Well, I'm going to pull out the troops from Portland, Oregon, Chicago, and I'm going to go with Los Angeles again. I'm a little tired." But I could come back. And people at the time interpreted that as, I wasn't fired, I'm leaving kind of thing, that this was something that he was going to show his power some other way. And you need to have that backdrop behind you too for what is happening in Venezuela. Okay, so now he has struck Venezuela, and he is taking out the leader of Venezuela and the leader's wife. Again, bad people. But he was on the Fox News channel this morning basically saying, now we have Venezuela's resources, primarily its oil and the sweet crude that is off the coast of Guyana. It doesn't really matter. The point is there are resources in Venezuela that Trump is now saying, again, he says a lot of stuff, but saying the United States now has control over. And that's one of the things that the administration has been saying, is that Venezuela took American oil and we want it back. And there's a long, complicated argument behind that, but suffice it to say that Venezuela did not take America's oil. That's a rabbit hole I'm not going to go down, because I wanted to get to this part, and this is actually why I'm here this morning. This is a really, really, really big deal that the United States has struck Venezuela. And the reason that it is such a big deal, aside from everything else I've just said, is because the United States, with this action, has signed on to the project of destroying the rules-based international order that the Allies after World War II worked with other countries to put together to prevent future wars. What that means is this. Remember, in the early 20th century, we had World War I, and then before that was even in the rearview mirror practically, we had World War II. And those wars are just hideous, hideous wars. I mean, they're world wars, right? And you know all the stories about both of them. At the end of World War II, the Allies, of which the United States was a major partner, recognized two things. They recognized that the world had to have a better way to solve differences between countries. And they recognized, especially Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower is going to become the United States president in 1953, was the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. And he recognized the importance of this. And that is, at the end of World War II, the world has nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons are game changers, because what they do is they say if countries get mad enough at each other and you get a wackadoodle in charge, and he doesn't use the word wackadoodle, but it works. He's talking not only about political extremists, but also religious extremists and other extremists who can commandeer a population. This is a little bit of a rabbit hole I'm going to give you, but this is a real issue after World War II. People are trying to figure out why populations will follow a wackadoodle like Mussolini or Hitler or whatever. And this is this is where a lot of my work centers, is how do you get a population to say, oh yeah, I'm okay with this. And Eisenhower cares deeply about this. It was actually studying Eisenhower, that got me interested in it, because Eisenhower recognized that it was such a huge deal for the world going forward. He was profoundly moved by having seen the order of prison camp and what humans would do to each other. And he recognized that if humans would do that to each other in a world that had nuclear weapons, they could literally end the world. So at the end of World War II, the Allies and their partners got together and said, we have to come up with a better way. And what they did is they came up with the idea that across the globe, there would be rules, that rather than just having rules within a state, within a country, that there would be rules for the world. And those rules, some of them were financial, some of them were, we've got the International Declaration of Human Rights. There are all these different ways that the countries in the world were supposed to work together. And crucial, crucial, crucial to that was the United Nations. The United Nations eventually becomes headquartered in New York, and the United States is like the anchor of the United Nations. And the United Nations matter for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons the United Nations matter is because it says other countries or countries cannot invade each other. You cannot just say, I want your oil and go into that country, which is the way we got into the messes of World Wars I and II. That you must respect each other's sovereignty. And then there are all these ways that we can work out disputes and so on. Now, there are people, and I am one of them, who have always felt that there was a weakness written into that charter. But I'm not sure that's a rabbit hole you want me to get into. The point here is that there were rules, and big countries were not supposed to invade little countries, bigger countries. So if you think, for example, about the first Gulf War, what the United States did under Republican President George H.W. Bush is they said to Iraq, no, you can't take Kuwait. And that, I don't know about you, when I was much younger then, and I was like, it's all about the oil. But in fact, there was the principle that Iraq could not simply say, hey, I'm taking Kuwait. We pushed, if you remember, the United States troops pushed Iraq back over the border and stopped. So, you do you, but we are going to make sure that you can't just take over a smaller country. All right, that's the rules-based international order. Now, Russia doesn't like that. Under Putin, Russia does not want the rules-based international order because it wants Ukraine, and it also wants other countries, but pretty openly wants Ukraine. And this has been a struggle that's been going on. Remember that the United States, Russia, and the UK promised that we would respect Ukraine's sovereignty if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. It did give up its nuclear weapons, and in goes Russia in 2014. And the United States stood against that, but somewhat half-heartedly. And this is the struggle that's been going on since then, since 2014, for the control of especially those eastern parts of Ukraine. Putin needs those. He wants those and he needs those. There's all kinds of problems in the Russian economy, which is actually quite an interesting rabbit hole that I won't take you down right now. But he wants and needs those industrial areas of Ukraine in order to prop up his own rule in Russia, and that's in real trouble right now. Meanwhile, he also recognizes that Trump's position, including his mental position, is dramatically weakening. So if he's going to get that, he's got to get that now. So one of the things that Putin has articulated repeatedly is the desire to get rid of the rules-based international order, which he says is threatening him, even though it's simply saying, no, you can't take over Ukraine. And he wants to replace it with something based in the idea of spheres of influence. That is, you'll get one really big dog in an area, and all the other countries are going to have to do what it says. And that's his plan for going forward. And he obviously wants control of Ukraine, and he wants to continue to influence and gain control over Europe. And this is one of the things that Europe is madly trying to prevent. You're seeing the militarization of the borders with Russia and the repeated defense capabilities increasing in Europe, and they're saying we're very concerned about Russia deciding it's going to do more than it is already doing in Europe, where it's poisoning people and attacking undersea cables and hitting infrastructure and so on. There was an attack on Poland less than a month ago, I think, in which a train track was blown up. So Russia wants to get rid of that rules-based international order because it wants more influence in Ukraine, and it also wants influence in Russia. But there's more than that. Russia can't do that on its own. Russia is not strong. Russia's economy, as I say, is in really bad shape. And Putin's got a real problem. He's lost more than 1 million men in his war on Ukraine, which he expected would take a few days, right? How can he possibly do that? He can't. But the biggest dog in the world is the United States of America. So if he could get the United States of America to sign on to that, the game has changed. And this is one of the reasons that a number of people, including me, have called attention to the United States's national security strategy document that came out about a month ago, in which the United States no longer said Russia was a problem, but began to attack Europe, our ally in this international rules-based order. With the U.S. attack on Venezuela against the tenets of the UN Charter, the United States is putting its stamp of at least condoning a big power attacking a smaller power. And you know that this is what's going on because instantly Taiwan, which is very concerned about an invasion from China, popped onto social media and said, hey, we're not buying this. We're still believe in our sovereignty. And Europe instantly said, we still believe in the rules-based international order because they want to hold off Russia. So what the United States just did is it said, we're tossing overboard the rules that have kept the world from another world war since the 1940s, and instead believing that we want to have our own sphere of influence. And you can see this with Trump talking about taking Greenland, which, by the way, in April, feels like a million years ago, Putin gave a speech saying, hey, take this seriously because the U.S. should have Greenland. Well, what's in Greenland is, of course, access to more resources, but also if the U.S. had more power over Canada, Greenland, the United States, and now South America, it becomes the hegemon of the Western Hemisphere here. It is a much weaker position for the United States than it has had since the 1940s, because rather than being part of the entire globe, we simply become the power that's going to grab all the resources in other countries. But it's one that looks very attractive to somebody like Donald Trump because of the degree to which he and his cronies can do what Putin has done, which is strip the lands for parts and put the money in their own pockets. And, already we are seeing people in Trump's circle reaching for the oil in Venezuela, and there's just going to be extraordinary corruption around this. Trump has done this without the approval of Congress. And that's the final piece here that you need to pay attention to. He is claiming the right to invade another country without provocation. I mean, this idea that these are narco-terrorists that are hurting the United States is a fantasy. Without provocation and without consultation with Congress. And this was really deliberate. The first attack on the boats was on September 2nd. That's the double tap strike that has, gotten such attention. But it was on September 2nd, and within 2 days, under the War Powers Act of 1973, the president has to inform Congress that he has done so. And Trump did that. And he said, I'm informing you because of the War Powers Act. But under the War Powers Act, the president has only 60 days to act without getting approval of Congress to continue those strikes. And Trump just blew through that. He never got that approval. And now he has just continued with that, going into Venezuela without Congress. Congress under the Constitution is the only body that can declare war. And again, under the War Powers Act, he ought to have consulted with them. It appears, as I say, very early days here, that he informed Republicans in the, at least on the Gang of Eight, that he was going in, but not the Democrats, which says he is declaring himself the leader of a one-party dictatorial state. And that's the other piece here. When you think about this, again, Maduro is nobody's buddy. He's just not. But there are the way that Trump has done this, and Trump's advisors, by the way, I'm not sure how much of this is Trump and how much he just likes the bangs, which is what he was talking about on the Fox News channel. The way he has done this not only destroys the rules-based international order, it also destroys another guardrail of the Constitution. So when I say this is a really, 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 really big deal, this is a cornered president who is in serious trouble with the American people and with legal issues over. I mean, he seems to think the problem with the Epstein files, at least so he says, is that people will be embarrassed. They're not hiding those files to stop people from being embarrassed. They're hiding those files because there's something huge in them. And by the way, I was an Epstein files skeptic, big time. But the more they're doing this and the more we're seeing, the more there's just got to be something there. Or they would have released them all. And then we've got Jack Smith out there right before January 6th, which is coming up in 3 days. And has been a real issue of concern for a lot of us, is that on the 5th year anniversary of January 6th, he would try something. Well, here we have an attack on the rules-based international order. Here we have an attack on the U.S. Constitution. And if we get rid of those two things, because of the direction and the ideology of people like Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, the next step in the United States is to move more and more into an authoritarian regime like that. And if that authoritarian regime like that gets its full hold here in the United States, you can look at Russia now, where there's a very few people who are extraordinarily rich, but whose lives are very much in danger. A lot of them seem to have a lot of problems with windows and poison. And you can assume that these trends that we're seeing in the United States already are going to be coming here. So when you see people saying, well, Maduro's a bad guy, this is a great way to get rid of him, this is the way the United States should operate, be very clear that Maduro is absolutely a bad guy. But if you break all the rules to get him the way Trump has done, what's being destroyed is not simply Maduro's regime. And by the way, I should have said this: heads of state enjoy immunity. There's no way that we should have the right to try him, especially since we did try and convict by a jury of the former president of Honduras, who was doing the drug trafficking, and Trump just pardoned him. So as people are saying at this point, Maduro's people are probably looking at how much money it will take to free Maduro if he puts it in the pocket of Trump, which is, of course, exactly what Putin does: grabs people and then uses them essentially as hostages. So this late or early morning strike against Venezuela is not simply let's get rid of a bad guy. It is, and by the way, there was an election in Venezuela in 2024. There is an elected leader that was not Maduro. My guess is the Trump administration is not going to be putting that person in power, but we'll see. But when you look at this moment, this is a huge crisis for the United States of America, not just for Venezuela. And it is a huge crisis for the world because of the breakdown of that rules-based international order that has kept us from a war since World War II. We've had local wars, but we've not had a world war, a war in Europe, for example. And it is a direct attack on the U.S., another direct attack on the U.S. Constitution. So don't be fuzzy about what happened here. And this would be a great moment to speak up to your Congress people, especially your Republican Congress people. The Democrats have already come out and said, excuse me, what are you doing here? But they are not in the majority. And a lot of the Republicans started out, even the far right ones started out by saying, hey, wait a second here, this doesn't look legal. And they're already starting to come around because generally, wars make a president more popular, and they don't want to buck Trump and say, uh, you know, we're going to back Maduro on this. Because again, Maduro's a bad guy. Light up these freaking phones, because I think if you've listened to me before, you've heard me say that we're facing a crisis, because Trump has gotten more and more and more and more cornered. And as I've been saying and wincing, the next 3 months, which I said 3 days ago, are going to be hideous as he and his people try to maintain control. Because it's coming down to the line here. Either they are going to grab control and turn the United States into a dictatorship, or the American people are going to take our system back, and we're going to make it based in the law again and not in personalities. And we're going to start to enforce the laws against corruption, and we're going to enforce the Constitution. And with luck, we're going to make this country and its rules and laws more responsive to everyday people. You can see that building. One of the reasons I highlighted the Mamdani speech yesterday, a lot of people said, well, we don't know what he's going to do. And I'm like, 100% we don't know what he's going to do. And I'm always a skeptic when a politician says they're going to do anything. But the language matters. The fact that, he's talking about using a government for good anymore, stopping corruption and so on. This is the moment for the next, like I say, 3 months is the time I give it. I'm thinking we're going to have an answer by May as to what's going to happen to the Trump regime. But now is not the time to roll your eyes and say, we always go into Latin America. The United States has a terrible history with Latin America, going back to the 1840s at least. That's a rabbit hole someday not even a rabbit hole. Someday I'll do a whole episode at least on that. But this is not that usual. This is an attempt to side with Russia to overturn the rules-based international order and align the United States with Russia rather than with Europe, rather than with democracies, rather than with the idea that countries should have their own right to sovereignty. And once we have given that up, we have not only given up the sovereignty of all nations, because all it takes is somebody with more muscle to come take you over. We will also have given up a significant portion of the American Constitution and given the president the ability to take the U.S. military and do whatever he wants with it without oversight by Congress. And so when those strikes, literally last night, I was finishing the letter and I was all set to go to bed. I wanted to go to bed earlier, but I was reading the news. And always when I finish a letter, I always am thinking about the next one. And I was actually sort of shaping out the next two. And I saw the first video coming out of Venezuela. I remember it was 1:38. And I was like, no. And then within 10 minutes, there was confirmation. And I thought, this is it. Here we go. On that note, please speak up. This is it. And it's going to get worse. I've maintained this all along. It's going to get worse. But the vast majority of Americans want the Constitution. They want rules. They want laws that apply equally to everybody. They want to be treated equally before the law. They want to have a right to a say in their government, and they want to have equal access to resources. And my friends, that is not a radical position. That is the same position that FDR had in the 1930s. It is the same position that Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, had at the turn of the last century. It is the same position that Abraham Lincoln took in the 1860s. That's what it means to be an American. And this is our moment to try and protect that for the 21st century. Anyway, by my calculation, Trump should be about to speak about what he's done. You can go hear what he has to say about it, but that's the backstory. That's what's at stake in the U.S. strikes on Venezuela. Thank you for being here.